want to thank all the folks here at Middletown for inviting me to be in this show and to present my work to basically my home community. Grew up in Cincinnati, so it's great to be able to do this. We had a couple nice workshops, had a nice lecture that we did to high school students. And so the idea, what am I supposed to talk to you guys about? And I didn't want to do one of those talks where just, I went to high school here, and I did smart like this, and I went to college and smart like this, and after college I did smart like this. I don't want to do that. I've been lucky enough to illustrate now for probably close to 45 years and teach illustration for about 30 of those years. Started teaching when I was living in Dallas, Texas. And over the years, at the time when I was asked to teach, that was not even in my thought process of being a teacher. I was just wanting to be an illustrator, focused on that. And when Judy Kaufman from Brookhaven College called me and asked me about teaching a class, I said, well, let me think about this. And so when you have to think about stuff, you go to your wife and say, help me think about this. and she thought it was a great idea. And so I started teaching and taught at Brookhaven for a while, and then eventually East Texas State. And after we started having kids, we moved back to Cincinnati, taught for a short time at Miami, and then eventually 19 years at Columbus College of Art and Design. And now I'm the director of the MFA program at Hartford Art School in Hartford, Connecticut. So teaching has always been very important to me, and particularly about illustration. And as a young person, when I was in school, you would take your art classes, and of course you always got your art history classes. Are there anybody in here take art classes when they were in college? I know there's some artists here. Okay, everyone who took the art classes, it was always history of art, and it was always fine art. I'm an illustrator. And I remember when I was in college, we didn't have a lot. The only thing we had was one book about illustration. So when I went to a workshop and started talking to some other illustrators, they would mention the name of somebody, but I don't know who that is. I don't know who that is. And I'm sitting there going, I graduated from college. I don't know anything. I don't know anything about the world of illustration, yet this is what I say I want to do. I mean, that's as stupid as saying I want to be a guitar player and I don't know who Eric Clapton is. It doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense. So whenever I started teaching illustration, I always injected a component into what I do about illustration, history of illustration, because there is a distinction. And so that's why I wanted to talk with you a little bit about illustration and fine art. I don't want this, and I hope in this talk I don't give the impression that this is a talk of illustration versus fine art. It's not that. It's illustration and fine art. I see them as two different things. I don't put one higher on the pedestal than another. They're different art forms. Just the same as in the world of music, opera is different than blues. And yet, you all know certain pieces of opera are powerful and beautiful things. Just like in blues, there's powerful, beautiful blues. So I've always felt that. And so, when you look at a piece of art, is it fine art or is it illustration? How do you make that determination? And what is the difference? What is the difference? And does that difference, does it really matter? In the end, does that matter? I think that's a real question. The thing is, you all know fine art because there are plenty of museums throughout the country and they display fine art for you to see. It's all there. Most of those museums do not display illustration. I don't know if you know this, but for example, the Cincinnati Art Museum has a Norman Rockwell piece of art in their collection. One piece, but I don't know if it's ever been, since I've been back to Cincinnati since 1987, I don't know if it's ever been displayed. I went there, they took me down to the basement and pulled the thing out, let me see it. It's a wonderful drawing about that big of David Copperfield with Bob Cratchit with Tiny Tim on his shoulder. So they've got it. And when you go to the museum, you get to see all different kinds of work, whether it's traditional narrative painting by great artists like Frank Dubonnet, or subject matter that relates to the figure, but in a very designed manner like Matisse, or something that is very abstract like that of Hans Hofmann. Whereas illustration, the very word illustrate means to make clear. So it has a narrative component automatically already there. And where we see the art of illustration is in the things that we hold in our hands that we see, or on a poster. So part of one of the things that I see as a distinction, if we have to really simplify it, is the art that you see hanging on the walls in your home and galleries, that is fine art. The magazine cover, the book cover, the brochure cover, the poster, that's illustration. That's about as simple of an explanation. And yet, does illustration influence fine art? Does fine art influence illustration? And I believe the answer is yes on both counts. Because Russ Heath did this comic book art before Roy Lichtenstein painted it 10 feet tall and had it hung in a museum and considered brilliant fine art. That's a Russ Heath illustration in a comic book. And you'll see more of that. So how did we get here? So the question is, okay, we see these distinctions, right? Are you with me here on this so far? So how did we get here? Because we start here with art. I mean, before humans had a spoken language, at that time, people were just nomadic. They just wandered about. There were the plow had yet to be invented that allowed us to be able to stay in one place and grow our crops and begin to build communities. And yet, yes ma'am?
Can you move your table and laptop just a little bit? It's obstructing the screen from some of our viewers.
Sure, absolutely.
Getting a little bit better for you?
Is that better?
Thank you so
There you go.
much.
No problem. Go ahead and start over. So, again, this piece of artwork is a cave painting. Now, I would not doubt that there is other artwork that was done prior to cave, not just cave painting. It's just because it's in a cave it survived. But still, when it's done in a cave, you know as well as I do that the person who did this, a man or a woman, we don't know, they didn't send an invitation out for a gallery show and say, come look at my paintings. I've got these paintings that are not going to knock the art critics on their ear. I'm going to shock the squares, with this great art. No. Why was it done? I have no clue. I don't even know whether, we really don't know all the details, but we just know we have an understanding that it's in our systems who we are, that we want to tell stories, and we tell stories with pictures. My old-time running joke was that artist is the second oldest profession. As I mentioned, we have a cloud that's invented, tigers from Euphrates River, civilizations begin to evolve, and there's a handful of people who have all the power, and they need stuff to be made, and they need to have stories told to explain to them why you have to be a slave and build this temple for me. Because if you don't, you know, they're actually sculpted pieces that show them collecting the taxes, and the people who are not paying their taxes are being beaten, to let you know. So, I mean, it went all the way that far back. So they were telling stories. And as more and more area civilizations evolved and had stories to tell, again, people didn't know how to read, they didn't know how to write, except a few elites, right? So the king wants to tell the story of how he kicked the butt of the French, right? And created the Anglo-Saxon empires. So you create the Bayeux Tapestry that tells the story of the Battle of Hastings. And this, of course, is just a tiny snippet of that tapestry. The big change comes along in, 1440, with the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg. And of course, that takes publishing to the masses, the better opportunity. Now, it took a while for it to get there, 1440, but most of the art that was being created, if there was art, were in publications that may have been scientific journals, things of that nature, religious journals, documents of that nature. But still, the people who had the money commissioned the art, right? And so the artists who wanted to get paid for their art, they worked for the people who had the money. Since the church had the money, Michelangelo takes the Last Judgment, which of course tells the story that if you live a good life, you get to go up there, and if you don't live a good life, you get to be down here and get the crap beat out of you, right? Down there. Very easy thing to see that. You see that right there? That's you if you don't behave yourself. Later on, merchants, because trade is opening up throughout the world, right? You have trade opening up between the East and the West and the Middle East. Trade is opening. So merchants are becoming wealthy, great. So they're now having wealth, so it's not just the church, it's not just the royalty. Now you have merchants who have money, and they can afford wonderful paintings for their wonderful homes. Where are they going to get them? They're going to get them from these artists. So the artists would have salons where they display the artwork, where people would then go and buy their art. That started in the 1600s. We can move forward a little bit, and we've got the coronation of Napoleon. Once again, he's got the money. He wants to document his coronation, this painting by David. So they say everybody in this picture is a specific individual who was in that specific spot for that moment of the coronation. They did not have photography, they did not have Walter Cronkite. What they had was David doing sketches, came up with a painting that basically documented, that's as close a representation of the coronation of Napoleon as we can have without a camera. Which is why also the art at that time had a level of realism, because it was communicating and documenting reality as best it could be, and as beautifully. And also, though, the artists themselves, as time evolved, they wanted to express themselves more and more through the art they were creating. So Géricault created this painting, The Raft of Medusa, which was documenting an actual nautical disaster that captivated France at that time, that nautical disaster, which a number of people survived it. And Géricault was consumed by this story. So much so, he wanted to create this painting, spent an enormous amount of time researching it. He would go to hospitals, go to morgue to study the flesh of the dead and the dying. He had his friends model for him. Eugene Delacroix modeled for one of the figures in this piece. And this piece was then put up on display in the galleries and the salons. And it was the toast. I mean, people came in from all over to see this great Géricault painting. Meanwhile, you get a little bit also, as I go into publishing. Now, let's get back out of the galleries, let's get back into publishing. This is one of the first political cartoons, illustrations, attributed to Ben Franklin. It was not done for the American Revolution. This was actually a piece of art that was done in support of during the French and Indian War, when we were fighting France during that time. And he was basically saying all the colonies had to join together, be able to support the effort so they could survive and win. At the same time, as we move a little bit forward, now we're getting up into the Napoleon painting. Artists are beginning to create art through the printing techniques and make prints that they could sell. James Gilray was very well known for doing political artwork, but also creating art that was on social commentary, mocked kind of the social classes at the time. Oftentimes would have the illustrations printed and hand colored, and then sold in the studio there that represented his work. Delacroix created for his Salons the large painting of the people, Liberty leading the people, whereas Daumier created this gargantuan political cartoon against the King of France, of him, his gluttoncy, he consuming everything, and people all the masses having to feed the gluttoncy, which of course, this was one of the first times a person's political cartoon got the artist thrown in jail for a period of time. This was publication. We also see in publication books now are getting to be more and more popular for folks, and so John Leach created the illustrations for Christmas Carol, along with other illustrators like George Cruikshank created book illustrations for publishing. Also here in the United States, Courier and Ives started printing prints that were etched prints and hand-colored and sold, and these that were very, very popular at the time were just your average citizen could get a nice print to decorate their home, and there were tons of artists who worked for Courier and Ives. I should have written it down. One of the early practitioners working for Courier and Ives was a woman illustrator in the 1840s, 1850s, doing artwork. She came from a family in England and moved to the United States and started working here. Edward Manet, this time, creating new forms. So artists at this time in salons, they're having to compete with each other, right? You got this guy, all these people, they're creating their artwork, and so therefore, each one of them is trying to capture the eye of the critics, of the people who are buying the paintings, and so therefore, painting began, the artists were trying to express themselves rather than simply keep creating a single picture. Artists are artists. I don't care whether you're an illustrator, a guitar player, a poet, a writer, a dancer. The creatives are always trying to, what I call, plow new turf. They're trying to plow new turf. And they're trying to find a way to create that 6 degrees of separation from the crowd. And so artists such as Edward Manet, which is considered one of the early beginning stages of Impressionism, where you were able to see actually much more of the brush strokes in his work rather than the highly polished things that you would see in David and Jericho. Okay? Meanwhile, publishing, as I say, is going on. Winslow Homer, how many of you guys knew that Winslow Homer started his career off as an illustrator? The illustrator. The illustrators know that. That's right. He was like a Civil War correspondent. He worked for Harper's Magazine. He would go out into the field. He would create a series of drawings. The drawings would be sent back to Harper's. They would have a series of engravers who would create the engraved replication of the Homer drawing for publishing and for publication in Harper's Magazine. As you can see, Turner is being much more expressive with his paint, as is Monet. And look at how art has gone from the tightly rendered art that we saw in David, and the artists now are beginning to be more expressive. And this really is like a classic definition of when you understand what impressionism means. That it gives you an impression of the image, not an exact replication of it. Other artists were breaking new grounds, and these are all the artists that most of you guys, if you were in a fine arts history and illustration class, these are the dudes. These are the big hitters. These are the big kahunas, right? In the world of fine art. Meanwhile, as I say, publishing now in the 1800s really begins to explode. Magazines, newspapers are absolutely everywhere. Cities like New York City, they don't have just one or two newspapers, they have a dozen newspapers. Cincinnati, for a time, I think had as many as 5 and 6 newspapers. Chicago had a number. Then you have other magazines, and then the magazines. You had women's magazines, Sundays, general magazines, humorous magazines such as Puck and Judge. Then you had books that had illustrated books like that of Tom Sawyer and the likes by Mark Twain. So publishing is going bonkers now. And even in the children's book market, people are finding that there is a market for children's books. And some of the great practitioners early days is Randolph Caldecott, which of course is where the Caldecott Award comes from. It's from his and Keith Greenaway. And in England, their version of our Caldecott is the Greenaway. And Kate Greenaway was so popular of an illustrator in her day that people would look at her artwork and buy clothing for their children based on the drawings of Kate Greenaway. Again, this is all no TV, no video games. Publishing is where it was at. And it was a place for artists to make a good living. Other magazines, Century Magazine, and then you also had Maxfield Parrish. How many of you guys have heard the name Rose O'Neill? Illustrators, right? Yeah, the illustrator, right? How many recognize, how many of you guys have heard of Cupies?
Cupie fan.
Huh? So she created the Cupie. She was the one who created the Cupie. She also was one of the first to start licensing it. And when she licensed it, in the toys, and the advertising, here's a period of time where Rose O'Neill was the highest paid artist, woman artist, in the United States. She made a bloody fortune off this. Maxfield Parrish, we'll talk about Maxfield Parrish as well. Other publications brought us artists such as Henry Farman and Frederick Remington, who started their art careers as illustrators, and of course later on, we all know their work through their Western art. Charles Danny Gibson. Charles Danny Gibson was an incredibly popular artist. To give you an idea of the kind of money that these guys made back then, in 1904, Charles Danny Gibson was given a contract by Collier's magazine for a 2-year contract for which he would create 50 illustrations each year. And he was paid $1,000 a drawing. Right? Again, but he, through his drawings, how many have heard the term the Gibson Girl? Right, the Gibson Girl. The thing that was unique about, if you would take a look at a lot of Charles Danny Gibson's drawings, the woman is the dynamic character in his illustrations. The men are much more, the woman is the strong character all the way through it. And so women would look at the drawings of Gibson and fashion. He was like a style trendsetter for styles for women in that day. Flag drew in very much a similar pen and ink style as Gibson, but Flag gave us probably the most iconic illustration that we have of an American illustrator to this day. About 20 years ago, actually before that, because I was working on trying to develop an ad campaign for illustration, and I wanted to get our people's idea. What were the top 20 illustrations of the 20th century? So I sent out like about 200 artists. And this piece here was the runaway train top vote getter. What's interesting is this was the runaway train, by far the top vote getter. He didn't get one second one. This was his home run. And do you know who the model was for this? James Montgomery Flagg. He was his own model. You know, when you're your own model, you work cheap. Other great illustrators at that time, Harrison Fisher, Franklin Booth from Indiana, with his pen and ink style. Now, I wish I had enough time to show you, but if you saw his pen and ink work, look him up sometime. Look up his pen and ink work. There's a recent book out on him by Alice Carter. He was so inspired. He grew up on a farm in Indiana, and he wanted to draw, and he would get the magazines, like I said, Harper's. You see those etchings? Well, he thought those etchings that he was looking at in the books, they were pen and ink. And he had a pen, so he started mimicking that etched look. And so his drawings, they look like etchings, but they're actual pen and ink drawings. He was mimicking what he saw. Charles Knight was a great illustrator. He was famous for the dioramas at the Museum of Natural History in New York, and he was one of the first artists who gave us the impression of what dinosaurs looked like. So he studied the science, worked with many of the scientists at the museum, and developed these illustrations. And there is actually, what is so cool about this, to show how artists get the reference. Okay, how would you get a reference for that? How do you do that? Well, he worked with the scientists and anthropologists, I guess that would be, or dinosaurologists, whatever they're called, paleontologists, is that what they're called? Paleontologists, right?
Paleontologists.
Yeah, paleontologists. Get those folks, and he actually sculpted a maquette. So he sculpted the maquette, photographed the maquette with the lighting that he wanted to be able to get the picture that he wanted to create. Howard Pyle is really, as far as illustration, he is one of the real names you guys should know. Illustrators don't answer the question. How many of you guys know the name Howard Pyle? Yeah. Howard Pyle is considered the father of American illustration. And one of the main reasons is the school that he started. Most of the artists, and we'll talk about some of them who were great artists here in the United States early on, they studied in Europe. They studied at great academies in France and Germany and Italy, and they studied art and came back here. They then worked at schools and taught folks like Rockwell and other artists. Pyle did not. He believed, and became an artist here, and he believed that there was enough here in the United States that we had enough that we could teach our own art. And he first started teaching at Drexel in Delaware, and eventually started his own school in Wilmington, Delaware. And this is, of course, one of his great paintings called Maroon, which is one of the really great paintings. And some of the people that went to his school, N.C. Wyatt, how many heard that name? N.C. Wyatt. Everybody knows Andrew Wyatt, right? You know Andrew? Okay, N.C. was Andrew's father. And for a lot of us, we think Papa was the best. We think Papa was the best. R.B. Dunn was another great illustrator who studied with Pyle. He was from South Dakota. He, too, like Winslow Homer, was hired by the military, went over to Europe during World War I to document World War I. And And these were some of the paintings he created. He created that. Another student of Pyle's was Frank Schoonover. There, of course, we see Wyatt was a product of that. And Elizabeth Shippen Green studied with Pyle. Dean Cornwell studied with Harvey Dunn, who studied with Pyle. So you got Pyle, Dunn, Cornwell. But the thing that's unique about Pyle at that particular time was the fact that he was one of the few schools that allowed men and women to study art together. During many of those early years, women had their own school, men had their own school. For whatever reason, they didn't want men and women drawing at the same time. I think it was partly due to, drawing the nude model. They didn't want the women to be drawing those giblets and things like that. Whereas, Pyle felt that women should study art and learn right alongside the men. And so, some of the great early women illustrators were products of Pyle. And the three major ones are Jessie Wilcox Smith, Elizabeth Shippen Green, and Violet Oakley. All of them were widely successful illustrators that had great careers. As a matter of fact, here's a picture of Violet Oakley on her scaffolding with one of her murals that she painted. It was a huge mural. And I love how she's beautifully dressed on it. It's just great. But look at the size, look at the scale of that piece of art that she's working on. Pretty magnificent. Other people that came from Pyle School women, Eleanor Abbott, Ethel Betts, Charlotte Hardy is one of my favorites, Anna Betts, and then Ellen Pyle. She married Pyle's son, and Blanche Grant. That's just a few of them. So Pyle dies in 1911. He was over in Italy, I can't remember what he got, but he died. And just 2 years later, how many of you guys have heard the Armory Show in New York, the famous Armory Show in fine art? That was a huge show that really kind of turned people's brains on about what contemporary art was going to be. Because, as you can see, some of the artists that are in this painting, or in this painting here, you can see there's Duchamp, Picasso, Chagall. And so you've got some of the early practitioners of modern art, 20th century modern art on display. And that really kind of turned people's head on what fine arts could be. And more you can start to see how where this division of what fine art is and what illustration is, you can kind of see. I don't think it's anybody sat down and said, okay, we're going to do this. So I think it's just this natural evolutionary thing that more or less took place, where art started to change. Whereas illustrators continued to do their work while fine artists were finding new forms of expression and telling the stories they wanted to tell. Whether there's a story or not, they just wanted to find new forms of expression. So Kandinsky, Matisse, and you had German Expressionism coming out at that time, Fauvism, and of course Picasso. And the amazing thing too, we could do a whole slideshow for an hour at least on Picasso, because for those of you who've studied art, you know Picasso's earliest works, the guy could draw. He was an amazing draftsman, amazing artist. And the only way I can describe it, it was like Picasso in some ways. He's being inspired, influenced, he's looking at art throughout the world. He's seeing art from Africa, art from Asia, art from China, art from India, all different parts of the world. And that's coming into his head. And he's trying to find new forms of expressing himself. It's almost like mathematicians trying to find new math to some degree. He's exploring the boundaries or the lack of boundaries that he could find in art. While illustrators, they too are, you can see right now, we go to from where the Kate Greenaway and what that was and what was going on there into more fantasy work that's coming into play as fantasy and children's book work is evolving. John Bauer, Arthur Rackham, Ed Dulac are great artists. Anybody hear of those guys at all? Dulac, yeah. See, these are people, look at this artwork, how great this is. And you don't see it in museums. You don't see it in museums. Other artists, Jules Guerin, Charles Livingston Bull, and Edward Penfield. I discovered Jules Guerin when I was looking through a Century magazine. And, you know, he's doing these illustrations of the Middle East. Because think of this, in 1890, the average person isn't traveling to the Middle East, and yet it's this incredible place. And they want to be able to show people different places in the world, like National Geographic would with photography. Century magazine used Jules Guerin. Jules Guerin, by the way, also created murals inside the Lincoln Memorial. That was some of his work. But his compositions are totally exquisite. Look up his artwork, incredible work. Some of the early wildlife artists like Charles Livingston Bull and Edward Penfield was a great poster designer. Maxfield Parrish is one of those artists. Now, I would think a fair number of you guys have heard of Maxfield Parrish, right? You know, the thing is, and what of course was fascinating about Parrish was he was wildly popular in his day. And he was one of those guys, I wanted to come back to it. He was one of the early guys, also along with, I mentioned, Rose O'Neill, who licensed his work. And he would create prints and posters of his work. And one of his pieces, I think it was Garden of Allah, I think it was 1927. His royalty check for that piece that year was $75,000. He was comfortably well off. He was comfortably well off. But he created works for children's books, magazine covers, posters, and later on a number of landscape posters for Curtis Publishing. Other great illustrators, J.C. Leindecker, Coles Phillips from Ohio with his Fadeaway Girl. That was a very famous style that Coles Phillips developed, and of course the incredible N.C. Wyatt with children's book work. Leindecker was so popular as an artist and so talented as an artist, he gave us, most of you might recognize the Arrow shirt man, which was very popular in its day. Again, culturally setting standards for people at that time, how to dress, how to present themselves. But Leindecker was so gifted as an artist. When he was studying in Europe as a student, people would come in off the street to be able to watch him paint. He was that talented and that good. John Held Jr., the flapper, he really created the icon and the image of the flapper. Art Deco with Erte and Rockwell Kent. Graphic designers are also creating posters. Oftentimes they're illustrated by nature. Some of the most compelling images, again, we may not see them in museums, but some of these images are iconic images that are totally ingrained in our heads, such as the Green Demon, you know, that you had for Absinthe, and of course the Normandy poster by Cassandre, and some of the early great travel posters by McKnight Coffer. These are all illustrated posters. I think this Leslie Reagan poster of the New York Central Railroad is one of the most dynamic pieces of art done by an illustrator of the 20th century. It was on my list of the 20. It was on my list as a 20. And Frank Paul, who was one of the early practitioners of science fiction art in Amazing Stories. And although it may not be technically one of the best illustrations out there, I do think iconic and what it started, Joe Shuster's Superman, I think absolutely is up there as one of the top illustrations of the 20th century. Norman Rockwell, of course, everybody knows Rockwell. And it's because he is so iconic and he is so talented. And the artwork he created for the Saturday Evening Post was so visible for everybody everybody to see. And of course, now they have the museum up in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The interesting thing, of course, is Rockwell, when I was in college, to admit that you liked Norman Rockwell, I mean, I may as well put a hood on my head and put 2 holes in it and say I like Norman Rockwell, because he was everything you are not supposed to be as an artist. And part of it was because of the fact he just only painted the idealistic America. He didn't take on any of the issues of the day. He wasn't down for the struggle, right?
He was.
Yeah, he was. Yes, he was. Yes, he was. And the fact of the matter is, when you consider as popular as Rockwell was, as dynamic and important as he was to America with his artwork, when Rockwell spoke, it really said something. When he said it, it really said something. And the amazing thing is, the piece on the left, which is the sketch, the painted sketch for the finished painting. And when the editor of, I believe it was Look magazine, I'm pretty sure that's who it was done for, when he presented the original painting, the editor said, the sketch is better, and he ran the sketch. And if you put the 2 side by side, I agree with him. I think that has as much power in that painted sketch as that painting you all know by Goya. It's a very powerful piece. It really is. And of course, I think one of the reasons why Rockwell kind of got a bad rap was because Rockwell was also the first one who said, I use photo reference. I use photo reference. It was kind of like the magician who comes out with a book and tells you, this is how I do this trick. All the magicians got all pissed off at him. Well, he was saying, like, this is how I do my art. Fact of the matter is, people have been using photography for photographic tricks, such as the camera obscura and grid systems, for as long as they could figure it out. They were trying to figure it out from day one. The fact that Rockwell was one of the first to admit it, I think, was one of those reasons. And other great painters of the Rockwell tradition were like guys like Mead Schaefer. Now, one of the things here is you're going to see a little consistency here with some of these, in the sense that, if you notice, most of these artists here are painting in oils, and they're painting in a very classic way. Why? Because they were taught by artists who studied in France, who were being taught traditional painting techniques, right? So they're getting that kind of instruction. And so here's Saul Tepper, who I think has to be probably one of the best, least known illustrators out there. Is there anybody who knows Saul Tepper besides Tim? Right? Right? No. You gotta look him up. He blow you away. Same thing with Mead Schaefer. His duotonal pieces that are just blue and black, and the lighting in these pieces knock you out. Another one is the great Dean Cornwell from Louisville. Great painter. Haddon Sundblom. Anybody know that name, Haddon Sundblom? You an illustrator too? Somebody asked me. You guys are showing yourselves when you know, okay? Think about Sundblom. Okay, you know, okay, tell me, do you recognize this guy? Santa Claus. Now, when you see that Santa Claus, what do you think of? Coca-Cola. You think of Coca-Cola? Think about this. How many times, by how many different artists have painted and drawn Santa Claus? But by virtue of one person's stylization, how they manipulate paint, and how they render it, it gets so ingrained in our head, we know exactly who it is. Think of the power of what that is. And once again, creating some of the most iconic imagery that we know of in the United States ever. He's not in a museum. You don't know. You don't know. He also did this. How about that? John Gannum. Now we're going to get a little bit away from the oils. John Gannum is a watercolorist. Harry Anderson, that's a gouache painting there by Harry Anderson. I mean, I think if you look at some of John Gannum's watercolors, they rival Sargent's watercolors. I think Sargent is the best. I mean, he's like from another planet. He's just freaky. But Gannum was super good, super good. We get into children's books, and the artists who create children's books, they too are moving forward from what we saw in the artwork of Dulac and Rackham. How are we doing time?
We're just about at 10 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, we're getting there. But you can see the stylization of even children's books is advancing. Caricature is becoming widely popular. These are some of the great early practitioners of caricature. Miguel Covarrubias, Paolo Giretto, and most of you should know Alfred Shelby. And of course, you know his work. So photography during World War II comes along, and it becomes it's like the first major conflict where photography plays a huge role in bringing, and document and short movie shorts, really bringing home the news to the American public. And so photography became wildly important. Even so, the American government still sent artists to conflict to create art. Herbert Eby, Howard Brody, Tom Lee, the famous Thousand Stair look there on the right of Tom Lee. Howard Brody, this was the one piece that was censored in Stars and Stripes. It was a drawing Brody did of a collaborator that was executed. There's a very good documentary if you want to watch about these artists in World War II. It's called They Drew Fire. You probably can find it on YouTube. I saw it on PBS probably about 8, 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. It's a great, great program to see about the artists who were the artists in World War II. Time magazine is using illustration on its cover every week. Other magazines were using artists now. If you notice, here they're painting mostly in gouache or watercolor. Why do you think that's happening at this time now? This is post-World War II. We're not using the oils. Deadlines are getting a little tighter. The drying time of the art, things of that nature. Artists are having to, and the other thing too is they're trying to find ways. I mean, do they want to just keep on doing another Norman Rockwell? Do they want to do another Salt Pepper? No, each artist is trying to find his or her own voice. Robert Fawcett. Fawcett's work had a certain look to it, primarily because he was colorblind. And he actually he was very strong in his value structure. Values were really a huge part of what he was doing. Austin Briggs, Tom Lovell, E. Sims Campbell, one of the early black illustrators in American history, did a lot of work for Esquire magazine. If you guys are familiar with the old Esquire, they had a character, famous character that was kind of like their little marquee character. It's called Esky, was his name. And E. Sims Campbell was the guy who designed Esky. Great illustrator, watercolorist. He also did great cartoons for the magazine. Same thing with women in illustration. Women were getting also not just, as you saw the Violet Oakleys of those. Well, now we're getting the 40s and the 50s, or women illustrators. They're coming into their own. Lucia Lerner, Barbara Schwinn was very popular. Now we're seeing some of fine art beginning to influence illustration, right? Some of the early Picasso and design works coming into play. Jim Flora. You know Jim Flora's from Bellefontaine, Ohio. And he went to school at the Art Academy of Cincinnati. You know, I don't even know whether, you know, who knows? I don't see anything up at the school on it, but really one of the really dynamic illustrators of jazz music in the 40s and 50s. Really important, along with David Stone, Martin and Cliff Roberts. Saul Steinberg and Andre Francois. Again, look how illustration has evolved from Parrish, Leyendecker into modern times, and how artists are following right along with the world of fine art, expressing themselves in different ways, even in children's book and animation. Contemporary art is being expressed in illustration. Ivan Earl, one of the really great designers for Disney, really worth looking up. Mary Blair has really been rejuvenated. Everybody all the kids are looking at Mary Blair, love her work as much as everybody loves the, you know, great Chuck Jones. Comic books have evolved from Joe Shuster to some of the great people such as Will Eisner, Jack Kirby, Wally Wood, and the amazing Jack Davis. Jack Davis was like my kid. This is my pop culture. This is my pop culture, which had a big influence on me and a lot of the work I do. And then I bring you back to Russ Heath and Roy Lichtenstein. Other great illustrators. Science fiction fantasy was really coming into its own, and artists are expressing themselves through doing science fiction fantasy work, such as Stanley Meltzoff. He also created artwork for National Geographic. This painting that he did, we had a book. It wasn't in the magazine, it was one of those National Geographic books. This painting so enthralled me. I used to dream about this painting. I would dream about that thing. I remember it. Robert McCall from Columbus, Ohio, famous for his 2001 Space Odyssey and all the great artwork he did for NASA. Incredible painter. Macaulay Connor. You would see a lot of his work. You remember when they made the TV show Mad Men? They were using some art illustration in that. That was Macaulay Connor's work. He lived to be 102 years old. They were using his work in that show recently. Joe Bullard, one of the greats. Barbara Bradley, another great illustrator. She later on left New York, moved back to San Francisco where she was from, and she ran the illustration department at the Art Academy in San Francisco for many years. Robert Weaver, he was the one who made big changes in illustration. Really brought, again, we're getting further away from the Norman Rockwell, more of a journalist, I would call it like a journalistic style in his work, which was design work. James Bama, we got about 5 minutes, 7 minutes, I'm going to get through. Bama was wildly popular, particularly in paperbacks, but he created that really iconic image of Robert Kennedy for a book cover. He left illustration, went out west, and started doing westerns, but he chose to do contemporary western themes. He just recently passed away. Frank Frazetta. Frank Frazetta is really one of the really iconic science fiction illustrators. He really created some of the iconic images that you know in science fiction. But the interesting thing is, he didn't start it. J. Allen St. John was doing Tarzan in the 20s and the 30s, and you can see the influence that J. Allen St. John had with Frank Frazetta. And Frazetta's artwork now is so popular and so collectible. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure it was the Egyptian queen sold for somewhere around $7 million. That painting, I saw it not that long ago at the Rockwell Museum. Another really major illustrator you guys should pay attention to if you can find anything out is Ernie Fuchs. Ernie Fuchs was an amazing artist who wanted to be a jazz trumpet player. He was playing the jazz clubs. He was like the lone white guy going into the jazz clubs in East St. Louis. And the musicians were like saying, hey guys, he's cool, he can play. And so he would play. When he was in college, he was working at a machine shop. The guy hit his button accidentally and dragged it down there right on his hand, cut the fingers off his right hand, this knuckle here, this knuckle here, this knuckle here. And there went his jazz career. With the compensation that he got, he went to art school at Washington University, Started his work as an illustrator, was doing art in Detroit for the car industry. And as a young illustrator, sent his portfolio to Cooper Studios, which was the studio in New York at the time, the studio. And Joe Bowler, we say, gotta look at this new kid's work. Joe Bowler opens up the portfolio, flips through about 6 pages, closes it, and says, this business is not gonna be the same. This guy here. Look at the compositions in these pieces. I mean, they're just images of a golfer at the Masters, a family out on the porch, Aaron Copeland at his piano. But look at the composition that's taking place in his pictures. He later on developed a technique with oils in which he created this, what we call the Bernie Fuchs glow, that which, I mean to tell you, everybody and his Dutch uncle tried to copy it, and they couldn't do it. I mean, this dude was the best at it. Nobody, I mean, Tim can tell you, Walt Spitzmiller tried it, Mike Dudash tried it, all these people. Dudash got close, but nobody did it like Bernie. Incredible career as an illustrator. Mark English, another illustrator from Hubbard, Texas. What makes an illustrator kid in Hubbard, Texas want to be an illustrator? Simple story. He sees a guy painting a rodeo sign. He's picking cotton for a penny a pound. He sees this guy painting a rodeo sign. He says, how much you getting paid for that? He said $50. He goes, I need to learn to do that. And he studies art and becomes the second youngest guy elected to the Society of Illustrators Hall of Fame. And to watch his career blossom and grow as it did, and the design work he created. He illustrated for many years, doing some of the most iconic images. I actually own that Dracula piece. It's one of my favorite pieces. He then retired from illustration, doing fine art work, and but still always very shape-driven, very powerful images. And we lost Mark in 2019. But it was amazing. I got to teach with Mark for 30 years, and we'd be teaching, and every Tuesday and Thursday he'd go up to the stairs to where we were figure drawing, and sit down and draw with everybody, because you can always get better. That was always Mark's thing. You can always get better. Milton Glaser, graphic designer / illustrator. He's mostly known as a graphic designer, but he actually went to school to study to be an illustrator, but he chose to become a graphic designer because he wanted to control how his art was presented. He didn't want to do a piece of artwork, turn it over to some art director, and have the art director butcher it. So he wanted to control it, so he created, that Bob Dylan poster is iconic as any images you can find. And of course, he created the I Heart New York logo too, and these great images. Brad Holland, contemporary illustrator. Brad Holland, along with J.C. Suarez at the New York Times, he literally redefined how editorial illustrations are used in a newspaper to accompany the editorial page. Up until that time, it was rarely accompanied with an illustration, and if it was, it didn't have the concept and the thinking that Brad Holland would bring to his pen and ink drawings. And of course, he later on did images such as this. He continues to paint and write. By the way, Brad didn't go to art school. Graduated high school, went to work at a tattoo parlor in Chicago, creating his work. But I swear to gosh, if you sat there and talked with him, he's the most well-read person you'll know. He's the most curious person you'll ever know, and one of the most competitive people you'll ever know. Brad never, ever stops learning. He never will stop. And that's why his work is so great. Gary Kelly from Cedar Falls, Iowa. Again, what makes a kid want to do this? Started working here, now he does this work. You would know his work from Barnes & Noble, and doing children's books, such as the Harlem Hellfighters book and the book on Robert Johnson. And those couple more recent ones we just met. I had our students meet Kadir Nelson when we were out in California, young illustrator. I first met him right out of college, and you could just see he was going to be gangbusters. And this is some of his most recent work that you should know. Doing great pieces. And And then we get into some of the other contemporary fields of illustration. Carla Ortiz, who works a lot in the gaming industry and concept art for movies, etc. So, I've just introduced you to and talked with you guys about illustration. We talked a little bit about the difference between illustration and fine art a little bit. I tried to introduce you to names of some of the artists. So if you are interested in this stuff, if you found any of this stuff interesting, you can go on YouTube, on your TV, you write that down. Unsung Heroes of Illustration. He is like up to like 96. And each one features like 4 artists. Every now and then he'll feature a specific artist, such as the one here on Rick Griffin, who did the rock posters of the psychedelic era out of San Francisco. But each one features 4 artists. He's got this wonderful Liverpool accent, where he holds and talks like this. And he talks about black and white artists. There's no black and white artists, they're monochromes. And it's not gouache, it's goulash. And so it's just wonderful to listen to. But a lot of the artists I know, but there's a lot of them I don't know. And I think I'm pretty good with my illustration history. This guy's off the charts. And you can learn so much. You get names of people, write it down, you look up more of their work. You will learn a ton of just how many things. So as I say, we know about the museums of fine art. There aren't a whole lot of museums for illustration. In New York, they have the Society of Illustrators. It's the Museum of American Illustration, one of the museums of American illustration in New York. It's near the corner of 63rd and Lexington, 128 East 63rd Street. And they always have shows up there. Every now and then they have an annual competition. Upstairs is the bar, where they got the great Dover Coach painting by Norman Rockwell. Other museums do have illustration portion of the Rockwell Museum. The Mazza Children's Book Art Museum up in Findlay, Ohio. University of Findlay has a museum dedicated to the art of children's book. In East Stroudsburg in Pennsylvania, I believe it is, there's the Frank Frazetta Museum. I believe this is in Connecticut or Massachusetts, is the Eric Carle Museum. And Columbus, Ohio has the Billy Ireland Library and Cartoon Museum. It is the best cartoon museum in the world. If you go up there, you can call them ahead of time and ask them to pull things out. They will pull out for you original Winsor McCay drawings of Gertie the Dinosaur, one of the earliest animated films in history. Not the earliest, but one of the early ones. And they've got those pieces. They have, I think, almost the entire Bill Watterson collection, who did Calvin and Hobbes, almost the entire collection of Milton Caniff, who did Terry and the Pirates, and Steve Canyon. They got Peanut. They've got it all there. So it's right there. So museums, we know about them having the art. So as I said, fine art, we see on the pedestal, on the walls, different places. Illustration, that portrait that I have of Barack Obama, that was on the cover of Time magazine. That's an artifact that's accurate. The original intent of how you were to see that image was in your hand, holding the magazine. That's how it was designed. The deadline I had on that piece, they called me on Thursday. The art had to be in New York on Monday. I mean, most of the any illustration that's in there I did for Time magazine, they called on Wednesday. The art had to be in New York on Friday. Which is why I oftentimes define also illustration as art done under the circumstances. Because that you're dealing with deadlines. So I leave you with this one here, contemplating. I ask you, as this young gentleman here, as this older gentleman is looking at this Jackson Pollock, as it's painted by Norman Rockwell, it leaves you with a question. Obviously, Norman Rockwell can't paint like Jackson Pollock. Do you think Jackson Pollock could paint like Norman Rockwell? I don't know. I'm not gonna answer that question. I'll let you figure that one out. And with that, I thank you very much.